Welcome to this explainer. We're going to dive straight into the gritty, deeply complex reality of America's first permanent English settlement. We are moving far beyond those sanitized, picture-perfect myths you might remember from grade school. Today, we're looking at Jamestown, which was, quite literally, the crucible of a nation.
Think about it for a second. How does a swampy, mosquito-infested island become the birthplace of America? Honestly, it's a miracle it survived at all. Jamestown wasn't some inevitable, glorious triumph of exploration. It was a desperate, wildly flawed experiment by the Virginia Company of London, and it nearly collapsed more times than you'd believe.
To really understand how this incredibly precarious outpost shaped the modern United States, we're going to walk through its history in 5 parts. We'll start with the disastrous beginning, move into the tobacco lifeline, look closely at the seminal year of 1619, explore the eventual conflict and collapse, and wrap up by unearthing Jamestown's hidden secrets.
Okay, Part 1. A disastrous beginning.
Let's set the scene back in 1607. The original settlers set up James Fort on a river island, picking that spot specifically to hide from Spanish naval controls. But that highly defensible location, it was functionally a death trap. It was an isolated swamp, absolutely buzzing with disease-carrying mosquitoes. The tidal river water there was brackish, meaning it was totally undrinkable. And to make matters worse, many of the original 104 men and boys were gentlemen or their manservants. These were guys who had never done a single day of manual labor in their lives, let alone tried to carve a settlement out of raw wilderness. But here's the real gut punch. Scientists recently looked at the tree rings of 800-year-old bald cypress trees in the area and found out these settlers arrived right in the middle of the worst regional drought in 700 years. So even if they had known how to farm, the earth just wasn't cooperating.
The sheer horror of what followed, it's honestly hard to wrap your head around. By 1609, John Smith, the one guy kind of holding the fragile leadership together, was injured in a gunpowder explosion and had to go back to England. Without him, and trapped inside the fort by the Powhatan Confederacy, the winter of 1609 to 1610 turned into an absolute nightmare known as the starving time. The historical record actually shows that lack of food drove people to eat snakes, and even boil their own shoe leather just for sustenance. And modern scientific excavations have backed up the absolute darkest rumors of this era, finding physical evidence that the most desperate settlers actually had to turn to cannibalism just to survive.
So what did all this mean for the people on the ground? And boils down to this devastating number, 60. Out of the 214 settlers who were at Jamestown going into that brutal winter, only 60 made it out alive. When a shipwrecked crew finally arrived from Bermuda in May of 1610 with some relief, they found the survivors hovering right near death. The rescuers looked around, judged the colony to be a complete lost cause, packed every single person onto ships, and sailed away. Jamestown was literally abandoned. Well, until another relief fleet miraculously met them heading down the James River and ordered them to turn right back around.
Which brings us to Part 2, the tobacco lifeline.
Just when the colony seemed like a total failure, a massive economic pivot changed absolutely everything. The investors back in London were understandably furious. They wanted a return on their speculation, and they were demanding pure fantasy. Bring back a lump of gold, find a guaranteed path to the South Sea, or at least locate a surviving member of the lost Roanoke colony. But what actually saved Jamestown wasn't gold or magic. It was a colonist named John Rolfe. He had smuggled in some untested tobacco seeds from the West Indies, seeds he'd actually managed to hold on to after being shipwrecked in Bermuda. The investors wanted gold, sure, but Rolfe's sweet-tasting tobacco ended up becoming their true economic lifeline.
This kicked off a 3-step chain of events that temporarily pulled the struggling outpost back from the brink. First, Rolfe successfully harvests a major tobacco crop in 1614. Suddenly a very prosperous guy, he then marries Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Powhatan. Now, this famous union wasn't just a romance, it was an incredibly strategic alliance. It brought several crucial years of peace between the English and the indigenous population, and that peace bought the colonists the stability they so desperately needed to expand their incredibly lucrative, booming agricultural business.
Now Part 3, 1619, a truly seminal year.
So, the tobacco economy is expanding ravenously, and they suddenly need labor, a lot of it. And it's wild to look at how these monumental events all collide in a single summer. In 1619, the General Assembly convenes right in the Jamestown Church, creating the very first representative legislative body in the Americas. Around the same time, Polish artisans staged the first recorded labor strike in colonial history. They basically refused to work until they were granted equal voting rights, and they actually won. But then, in August, an English privateer ship called the White Lion drops anchor, carrying the first documented enslaved Africans in English North America. It is just a profound historical juxtaposition. the birth of American representative government and the inception of enslaved African labor, happening at the exact same time in the exact same place.
You might be wondering how we get from there to the deeply entrenched slavery we learn about later. Well, it's essential to understand that the labor system in Virginia evolved over several decades. At first, many English and European immigrants came over under indentured servitude, where they'd agree to work for 3 to 7 years just to pay off their transatlantic boat ticket. The first Africans in Virginia actually worked under a similar system at first, and historical records show some even eventually became free landowners. But as tobacco farming demanded more and more bodies, the laws grew increasingly brutal. The system gradually morphed from temporary servitude into the permanent, modern, race-based conception of slavery that was firmly formalized by the 1660s.
Moving into Part 4, Conflict and Collapse. This endless hunger for tobacco-growing land basically guaranteed that the fragile peace with the Powhatan Confederacy wasn't going to last, and the tension finally exploded on the morning of March 22, 1622. Chief Pocahontas, who had taken over after Powhatan, recognized the very real existential threat these expanding English plantations posed. So he led a highly coordinated surprise attack across the outlying settlements. Over 300 English settlers were killed in a single day. To put that into perspective, that wiped out roughly a third of the colony's entire English-speaking population in one fell swoop. That 1622 attack really triggered a slow road to abandonment for the physical town of Jamestown itself. By 1624, King James had seen enough mismanagement and completely revoked the Virginia Company's charter, turning Virginia into a royal colony. Then another massive attack by the Powhatan hit in 1644. Fast forward a bit to Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, and Jamestown was actually deliberately burned to the ground by its very own colonists. They rebuilt it, sure, but the State House accidentally burned down again in 1698. Finally, the government realized this swampy island was just fundamentally a terrible place for a growing capital. So in 1699, they packed up and permanently moved inland to Middle Plantation, which they renamed Williamsburg. Jamestown was essentially just abandoned to the elements.
And finally, Part 5. Unearthing Jamestown's Secrets.
For the next couple of centuries, this abandoned site was heavily farmed, it was occupied by armies, and it was slowly being eaten away by the river. Historians honestly believe the original 1607 fort had been entirely swallowed up. Yet, miraculously, the site survived. During the Civil War in 1861, Confederate soldiers built earthworks right over the historic site to blockade the river. In 1893, early preservationists managed to acquire the ruined 17th-century church tower. The National Park Service finally stepped in during the 1930s to help protect the area. But the real game-changer, that happened in 1996 with the launch of the Jamestown Rediscovery Archaeological Project.
And what they found literally rewrote the history books. The Jamestown Rediscovery Team actually located the footprint of the original 1607 James Fort. And you know what saved it? A seawall that had been built back in 1900 to protect the island from erosion had inadvertently preserved the original site underneath. Since that discovery, archaeologists have uncovered millions of artifacts. These ongoing digs are bringing us face to face with the gritty reality of our past, uncovering everything from the armor those early settlers wore all the way to the physical remains of the individuals who suffered through that horrific starving time.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you to ponder a really profound historical paradox. How do we even begin to reconcile Jamestown's dual legacy? This was a desperate, swampy, mosquito-infested crucible that somehow planted the seeds of both American representative democracy and American chattel slavery in the exact same soil, in the exact same year. It forged the very best and the absolute worst of the nation that followed. Definitely something to think about the next time you consider the origins of America. Thanks for joining me, and keep exploring.